Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into an epic journey. We're talking over 20,000 years of history here. We're going to see how the literal forging of the French nation gets completely tangled up with one of the absolute most explosive events of the Middle Ages, the Crusades. It's a wild ride of absolute power, totally devastating plagues, religious fervor, and basically humanity's never-ending struggle for some kind of stability. All right, here is our roadmap. We'll kick things off with forging the French nation, then move into the call to holy war, the rise and fall of Outremer, the age of absolute monarchs, and wrap up with revolution, empire, and modernity. This is going to be our anchor to track the rise and fall of these massive empires, both at home and abroad. Part 1. Forging the French nation. Let's zoom right in on the very foundations of what would eventually become modern France, way before the borders we know today were even a thing. We're starting way back. Think 15,000 BC with those magnificent ancient cave paintings of Lascaux. Fast forward a bit, and the region is packed with Celtic peoples. The Romans called them Gauls. In 52 BC, Julius Caesar completely crushes it at the Battle of Alesia, bringing Gauls straight into the Roman world. But, Rome eventually falls, and in swoop the migrating Germanic tribes. By the 5th century, the Franks, led by King Clovis I, basically subjugate everyone around them, laying the cultural groundwork for France. This Frankish powerhouse hits its absolute peak when Charlemagne is crowned Emperor of the Romans in the year 800. Now check out how fleeting that unity actually was. Charlemagne's massive empire, it didn't last long after he died. By 843 AD, it got sliced up into 3 pieces for his grandsons, with West Francia covering most of modern France. But here's the real kicker. Royal power absolutely shattered. Local warlords and nobles just started carving out their own mini-kingdoms. So what we end up with is this highly fractured, super heavily militarized feudal noble class. And honestly, it was exactly this restless warrior class that was about to look far beyond their own backyards for power. Which brings us to part 2, the call to holy war. So while royal authority in France is totally fragmenting, we need to zoom out to the broader Mediterranean, because a massive geopolitical earthquake was shaking up the ancient world. Back in 1054, a huge religious dispute triggered the Great Schism. The Christian world literally snapped in half. You had the Roman Catholic Church in the west, answering to the Pope, and the Orthodox Church in the east, anchored in Constantinople. This split is absolutely crucial to understand because decades later, the Byzantine emperor in the east was facing total military disaster, and he makes the fateful decision to beg the Catholic Pope in the west for military aid against advancing Turkish forces. But hey, the East was just as fractured. The Islamic world was definitely not a monolith. It was split between rival caliphates, the Abbasids in Baghdad, the Fatimids in Cairo, and the Umayyads over in Spain. And plunging right into this giant mess were the Seljuk Turks. They were this incredibly formidable nomadic force from Central Asia who rapidly moved south, converted to Sunni Islam, and just started seizing territory right and left, including Jerusalem. The whole region was completely ripe for disruption. 100,000. That is the staggering estimated number of people who mobilized when Pope Urban II answered that call for help, kicking off the First Crusade. I mean, think about that. Moving 100,000 people over 2,000 miles from Europe to the Middle East, that was an almost unthinkable logistical and financial nightmare for medieval Europe. So how in the world did they pay for it? Well, to fund these massive holy wars, knights pledged their feudal estates to monasteries as collateral just to get the upfront cash for their gear. They called this a mortgage, which in Old French literally translates to death pledge. Basically, if you died in the Holy Land, the monastery just kept your land permanently. So yeah, these crusaders accidentally invented the modern financial concept of a mortgage. How crazy is that? The real spark for all of this was Pope Urban II at the Council of Clermont in 1095, down in southern France. He told the crowd that marching east would earn them a remission of their sins, and the crowd just completely erupted, shouting Deus vult, God wills it. It was like a match in a powder keg, igniting this terrifying, uncontrollable wave of religious fervor all across Europe. But this massive mobilization went off the rails really fast. Before the knights could even get organized, tens of thousands of peasants just marched east on their own in the disastrous People's Crusade, and they violently massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland along the way. When the actual armies finally got to the east, they swore these super uneasy oaths to the Byzantines, suffered through an absolutely grueling 7-month siege at Antioch, and then, in July 1099, they reached Jerusalem, and their pent-up fervor just gave way to an indiscriminate, brutal massacre of the city's inhabitants.
Part 3, Rise and Fall of Outremer. So they captured the Holy Land, right? But now they faced a huge new problem. How do you actually govern and hold on to this deeply hostile territory?
Well, they set up a series of states, the most famous being the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Collectively, they called this Outremer, which is just Old French for overseas. But these French-inspired feudal kingdoms were hanging by a thread. They were just this narrow little coastal strip completely surrounded by much larger Islamic powers, entirely dependent on supply lifelines stretching thousands of miles back to Europe. Those lifelines were kept open by Italian maritime states like Venice and Genoa, handling all the shipping. And, while the Crusades were incredibly destructive, it wasn't all just swords and sieges. Eastern luxury goods, like silk and spices, started flowing back to European markets. Even more crucially, advanced Islamic knowledge in medicine, math, and philosophy made its way back to the Christian West, fundamentally reawakening Europe. It also birthed some insanely wealthy military orders, like the famous warrior monks, the Knights Templar. But honestly, Outremer's days were numbered. Their fragile grip finally shattered in 1187 thanks to the tactical genius of Saladin. This brilliant Kurdish general managed to unite the surrounding Islamic forces, absolutely crushed the Crusaders at the Battle of Hattin, and retook Jerusalem. Europe was shocked, for sure, and launched more crusades, but the zeal was definitely fading. In fact, things devolved so badly that during the Fourth Crusade, Western Christians actually ended up attacking and violently sacking the Orthodox Christian city of Constantinople. Just total chaos. Moving on to Part 4, the Age of Absolute Monarchs. By 1291, the Crusader presence in the Middle East was permanently snuffed out. So let's zoom back in on France, which was currently grappling with the absolute horrors of the late Middle Ages. One half. Up to half of the entire French population was completely wiped out when the Black Death hit in 1348. It's hard to even wrap your head around that level of catastrophe. And this was right on top of the seemingly endless misery of the 100 Years' War against England. The kingdom was effectively brought to its knees by war, famine, and plague. Yet out of this immense trauma, a highly centralized state started to form. First, you have Joan of Arc famously rallying the nation in the 1400s, pushing them to victory against the English by 1453. Then, a brilliant cultural renaissance blooms under King Francis I. But society was still deeply fractured, which sparked the horrific French wars of religion in the 16th century between Catholics and Protestants. It wasn't until King Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598, granting some limited religious toleration, that order was finally restored. Basically, all this chaos perfectly set the stage for a regime that demanded total, absolute control. Enter King Louis XIV, the Sun King. He literally personified absolute power and its biggest flaw. Reigning for 54 years from his impossibly opulent palace at Versailles, he expanded French borders and turned France into the greatest power in Europe. But here's the catch. His endless, aggressive wars, plus his decision to just outlaw Protestantism entirely, absolutely wrecked the economy. So the blinding splendor of Versailles? It was really just hiding a desperate, bankrupt nation. Finally, Part 5, Revolution, Empire, and Modernity. As the 18th century Enlightenment started spreading radical new ideas about reason and individual rights, that financial breaking point finally arrived. In 1789, totally out of money and out of ideas, the monarchy lost its grip. The Bastille was stormed, and boom, the French Revolution kicks off. At first, it's all about liberty and equality, but things escalated rapidly. By 1792, the monarchy is gone. The very next year, King Louis XVI meets the guillotine. And just like religious fervor triggered all that violence during the Crusades, the fierce political idealism of the Revolution spiraled straight into the bloody Reign of Terror under Robespierre. Thousands of people suspected of being enemies of the Revolution were executed. Out of that sheer chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant military commander who just crowns himself emperor in 1804 and completely redraws the map of Europe. That is, until his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. The rest of the 19th and early 20th centuries were just an exhausting roller coaster for France. We're talking rapid pivots between restored kings, brand new empires, and a desperate struggle to build a stable republic. And of course, all this turbulence is punctuated by massive conflicts, culminating in the horrific trench warfare of World War I. Emerging from the devastating ashes of not just one, but two global world wars, France had to reinvent itself all over again. Under Charles de Gaulle, who established the current Fifth Republic in 1958, France dismantled its overseas colonial empire. They pivoted to a highly independent foreign policy and eventually tied their future to European unity, ratifying the Maastricht Treaty in 1992 and adopting the euro in 1999. I'm going to leave you with a provocative thought to wrap up our explainer today. We've just traced the absolute extremes of human ambition, from the blood-soaked Crusader kingdoms to the ridiculous splendor of Versailles and the chaotic fall of the Bastille. As we look at the echoes of these massive historical shifts, where simple ideas morph into violent dogmas, how are these exact same cycles playing out in our world right now? Today, how do we balance the intoxicating pull of absolute authority against the messy, chaotic reality of true human freedom? Something to think about. Thanks for exploring this history with me, and keep questioning the forces that forged our present.